And we are, of course, recording this just so everybody's aware. Okay, we've opened up the lines and we can see the number of participants steadily climbing. So just welcoming those people that are right on the money and coming on the hour, but we'll hold on for a couple more minutes to see how many we get before we start talking. Hello again. We're a few minutes after the hour and the numbers are still slowly climbing, but we'll begin shortly. So everybody's takes the seats and gets their popcorn ready, then we can begin. Other snacks are also available, of course, for those people who don't like popcorn. Okay, let's kick off now. We've reached an even number. Welcome to the Global Wind Workforce Outlook webinar that we're running today with GWO and GWEC. We're taking a special focus today on the EMEA region, simply as a way of making sure that we can get within people's time zones. We'll look at some of the global issues, of course, which were behind the workforce outlook, but also take a special focus in some of the countries which we did a country commentary on within the EMEA region. On the call today, I have Andrea Scassola, who's the let me just get these right because we've also had a little question about what people's titles are. Business Analytics Manager at GWO. We have Anjali Lathigara from GWEC, who is Lead in Market Intelligence in APAC region for GWEC. We have Glen Wright, who is Knowledge and Data at REN21. We have Anke Jordaan, who is Head of Design and Marketing Manager, SP Wind in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Here we are. Here's some pictures of the people you'll be hearing from today. First off, we are going to have a look at the agenda, of course, which would be the normal sense thing, talking about the speakers as just done. We'll kick off firstly with Andrea, who's going to tell you a little bit about the Global Wind Workforce Outlook report and his work behind that. He'll talk about some of the methodology and the approaches that we've been doing with GWEC over the past couple of years, 4 years, I think now. He'll talk about the report findings, and then it's a great delight for Anjali Lathigara will tell us a little more about the country commentaries that she helped create for Kenya and Egypt. That should take us to about the halfway mark, and then we'll invite Glen and Anke to join a panel discussion, talking about some of the issues that perhaps have come up through the presentation. We'll keep an eye on any questions that you raise through the general chat channel, and we'll take it from there. There'll be another half hour or so of panel discussion about issues which seem to be pertinent. So I would say over to Andrea, who's in control of the presentation deck, to start us and tell us a little more about what the report objectives were.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. So before we dive into the content of the report, I'd like to make a premise on why we believe it's useful to forecast the technician workforce. One reason is visibility. It helps training providers allocate supply capacity where and when it's needed. And the other is preparedness. We really hope that this can help align expectations across different stakeholders so that there is a correct match of demand and supply. Talking about match of demand and supply, we have noticed that mismatches have become an issue for the supply chain in the course of 2021 and 2022. And there could be situations where the supply of industry standards training cannot keep up with the increasing demand for workforce. In this case, we would need policymakers to acknowledge that and also to work to fill in the gaps as much as possible. For example, with programs that are designed to support the transition of workers from sunset industries to renewable energy. Today, what we want to do is answer 3 questions. What's the size of the wind workforce from 2023 to 2027? How many people today have a valid training certificate in line with industry standards? How many people need wind-specific training in the EMEA region? And then what are the drivers for demand for workforce in each sub-region? Finally, with Anjali, we will focus on Middle East and Africa, and in particular on 2 countries, Egypt and Kenya. So in the wind industry, workforce is employed throughout many different phases of project development, but industry standard training takes place predominantly during construction and installation and the service part of the value chain. The forecast in scope for this report exclude the workforce from other segments of the project life cycle, such as, for example, research and development, procurement, manufacturing, which is traditionally the most labor-intensive segment, at least in certain markets, transport and decommissioning. The result of our model is the number of wind technicians that we need to be ready for the construction and installation and for the operation and maintenance of the global wind fleet, both onshore and offshore. These numbers also reflect the total number of people who will need to have safety and technical skills during the outlook period. The data foundation of this forecast, first of all, the most important one is GWEC's capacity forecast, both on an annual and on a cumulative basis. The inputs, some turbine ratings, also coming from GWEC, project level data, and then these data are combined with inputs on the typical workforce needed for onshore and offshore wind. projects on people per turbine, and which we estimate will be based on the input from our member network. Then once we derive the number of operational turbines and the number of new turbines installed each year, we multiply by the respective people per turbine ratio. And finally, we obtain the number of people needed to both build and service onshore and offshore wind assets. So starting from the baseline, GWEC produces industry-leading market forecasts, and their expectations are rather impressive. We have almost 700 gigawatts added in the next 5 years, leading up to an installed base of almost 1.6 terawatt by 2027. Since we focus on the forecast on the workforce that works on both construction, installation, and on O&M, we use both forecasts as input to our model calculation. So let's look at both. Workforce dynamic follow typically different patterns depending on the stage of project development. Since the cumulative capacity typically grows in an incremental manner, demand for O&M technician grows in a linear way and without major fluctuations. On the other hand, when we look at demand for technicians involved in construction installation, this kind of workforce is more volatile because it flows annual installation trends. So throughout the outlook, there are some efficiency gains associated with the increase in turbine rating, which we have seen in the markets, especially in the last 10 years, and will go on going forward. And typically, the number of people involved in the construction and maintenance of a turbine do not vary very significantly based on the size of the machines. Therefore, as the outlook progresses, machines with higher rating will tend to slow down the increase in the total number of people that will be needed on a per megawatt basis. The global wind technician workforce is expected to increase by 17% over the next 5 years. Onshore wind additions increase at a stable annual rate, and therefore the demand for onshore wind technicians required for construction installation remains flat year over year. By contrast, if we look at offshore wind additions, they will grow quicker on a year-on-year basis, and therefore technicians involved in offshore wind construction will be comparatively more in demand. O&M grows steadily together with the cumulative fleet, and this counts for both onshore and offshore without major shocks in demand. Overall, offshore wind is expected to grow faster, and so will the demand for workforce within that sector. At the same time, we have to notice that onshore will still have a higher critical mass in the total workforce included in the report. So looking at Europe, during the last years, we have seen a lot of competition in wind power markets, especially since 2017, when all the largest markets, Germany, France, and Spain, started to transition to auctions. And this has generated long-staying expectations for sustained cost reduction. These expectations have become less realistic, especially during 2021 and 2022, when faced with inflation, European OEMs found themselves with limited options to pass higher costs off to customers and were forced to raise their turbine prices as a result. This caused hesitation in investments from developers, and developers had to review the cost assumptions of several projects and engage in longer turbine supply agreements, with the result that order intake slowed down significantly. So now, as you can see from the graph, the near-term outlook for Europe is relatively flat until 2024, and growth is more pronounced in Middle East and Africa in comparison. In regards to workforce, we estimate that roughly 160,000 people will need training to build and maintain onshore and offshore wind assets in the EMEA region. Workforce growth in the onshore O&M segment will be relatively flat, and construction, on the other hand, will drive demand for workforce both on land and at sea. So more than half of the workforce needed will be concentrated in Europe's largest wind markets, which are Germany, Spain, the UK, and France. As we know, technicians move, so some work for different contractors and in different industries. So ultimately, they need a training certification in order to be able to work, especially across boundaries. So this means that typically established wind markets in Europe, especially offshore, we can see that they have a healthy oversupply of certified technicians. As we can see from this graph, not only the workforce in scope for industry training in Europe is much larger than that in Middle East and Africa, but the vast majority of it is already covered by the industry standard training compared to only 22% of it in the Middle East and Africa. On top of this, if we add that the workforce needed in Middle East and Africa is expected to more than double in the next 5 years, then we realize the urgency of building capacity in order to secure human resources locally. With this being said, I now leave the floor to Anjali from GWEC for an overview of the wind power markets in the EMEA subregion and the workforce needed in 2 specific countries, which are Egypt and Kenya.
Thanks, Andrea. Hello, everyone, and very good afternoon or evening from wherever you are. I'm Anjali Lathigara from GWEC, and I lead market intelligence for APEC region. Today, I will focus more on the EMEA sub-region and 2 focus country, Egypt and Kenya, for the webinar. So, GWEC publishes the global wind market outlook twice in a year, and as per the Q1 2023 data, we see that more than 17 gigawatt of onshore wind capacity will be added in Middle East and Africa. When we see as a percentage, of course, it's very smaller, 1-digit amount, but it has vast opportunity for every stakeholder to do a lot more. Here we have focused Egypt and Kenya. Why? Because we see that this has a political will and great potential to explore. And of course, both of these countries, if we see the developments happening in these countries, then we find that both are on the path of increasing the energy access percentage and also becoming one of the renewable energy leaders in the continent itself. Apart from Egypt and Kenya, there are several countries which also has good percentage share, which will share in 17 gigawatt. Of course, there are South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco, but this time we are focusing in terms of giving the regional diversity and market growth. We are focusing on Egypt and Kenya. As I said, another reason is the vast potential available for wind to explore, and the second is the good political vision to harness this potential available. Both of these countries are emerging ones and plays a good role in this Middle East and Africa region. If we go to next slide, I would like to more highlight on Egypt and Kenya. This gives a policy snapshot, and what I'll be focusing more for next 3 to 4 minutes, I will highlight what has been the target and development level happening in Egypt and Kenya, and what are the reasons we see that this will become a good markets for everyone to explore, and this will pose a good opportunity for wind workforce needs as well. So one of the reasons I would start with Egypt is that it started its wind energy exploration way back in 1988, and after 2 decades of modest renewable energy targets, during COP26, it signed several gigawatt scale, project MOUs with government. The business leaders have signed MOUs with government of Egypt. So, and one of the examples is that 10 gigawatt of project MOU signed by Masdar and SEWA Power. There are several examples of such, but if we look at the current installed capacity, total current installed capacity in Egypt, it is 1.7 gigawatt, and GWEC forecast that it will go up to 4.3 gigawatt by 2026. And based on the MOUs signed during COP26 and later in the period till date, we think that these MOUs can kind of uh, uh, have the 1 gigawatt annual installation after 2027, and this will give a total culminating amount to more than 8 gigawatt by 2030. So this gives a huge opportunity for wind workforce needs. And this the chart in the left side corner shows that the wind workforce currently was in 2022 it was 1,000, and it will almost triple by 2027, which is more than 3,000. Now moving on to Kenya. Well, before I move on to Kenya, I want to also highlight that GWEC is also kind of currently leading in establishing the country level association for wind energy market growth, and it is supporting in planning and making the strategy with country level representatives. Well, Egypt is also having good offshore wind potential across its Mediterranean and Red Sea coastal region. It has also signed several MOUs to explore and study its hydrogen potential available in the region. So all in all, it gives a good highlight why it is very much important for industry to see in terms of training needs required to explore the wind potential available in Egypt. Now moving on to Kenya, well, Egypt has 42 to 43% of renewable energy target in its energy mix by 2035. Kenya is way ahead, and it targets 100% renewable by 2030, and it announced this target at COP26. So this gives a good a snapshot of ambitions available in the political vision. And it is also committed to fuel green industries in the future by 2040. So of course, wind will play a great role into it. And its current wind installed capacity stands at 440 megawatt by the end of 2022, and GWEC forecast that it will go up to more than 550 megawatt by 2027 in next 5 years. So there are several policy developments which will make you realize that how Kenya is also one of the emerging and diversified market. It is actively working on developing its energy mix planning. It is also working on making its wind market very competitive, and also gradually reducing its feed-in tariff-based policy to power for wind power procurement. So all in all, I would say that there are multiple issues in every wind potential market, and we also see that policy developments in both of these markets are required around permitting issues, making the grid available to evacuate the power generated, and also the de-risk the full deployment process, and also acquiring land and making a social awareness campaign which ultimately help them to faster to foster the energy transition plan and be green as much as possible. So for Kenya, the wind workforce needs required as per the installation. It says that more than 550 workforce needs will be required by 2027. And I think here I will stop and hand over back to Andrea.
Andrea, did you want to add some commentary to Anjali's?
Yeah, I
No,
have
not for the time being.
Okay, then if everyone's happy, we can move on to some of the panelists and hear their views on the subject. I mean, the first person I would like to sort of ask to respond to that is Glen Wright from REN 21. I just wanted to, with this is so far we've been talking about the wind sector, and that's obviously the area that GWEC and GWO know most closely. We're short of workers globally. How does this sort of fit within the general context of the renewables sector overall? Are we fighting for the same people? Are we looking for more engineers overall, or how does it work in a bigger context? As an important fish or a big shark?
Well, I mean, I would hope that it's never a zero-sum game, and that obviously the kind of broader transition to zero carbon and to renewables globally, will require huge upscaling in finance and policies and reskilling of workers, particularly from fossil fuels. So, I'd like to hope that there will be enough jobs to go around. I mean, what we see, especially in the last couple of years with disruptions from the pandemic, is that the solar industry was hit a little bit less strongly by disruptions. And so fewer jobs were lost. Wind struggled a lot more, so fewer jobs were created. And so, I mean, clearly increasing wind, which tends to have a much more global supply chain as well, is, a clear opportunity to create good jobs, and to reskill.
That's good to know. But in terms, we've also heard from around the world in terms of some countries where there's good examples of growth within the wind sector. Anything you particularly noticed from your work in terms of case studies from Europe or in other parts of Africa where there might be important lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple pathways to increase, jobs and to meet the kind of need for jobs in the future. Obviously, promoting renewable energy, which is what we do in general, is important. The more renewable energy, the more jobs that there will be. So obviously, there's the kind of climate and renewables targets, which are sending like a clear market signal for long-term development. So, in the EU last year, the targets were increased from I think 40% to 45%. By 2030. And so, this doesn't sound like very much, but actually there will be a huge need for new jobs to meet that. And for example, I mean, the EU Green Deal has an industrial plan, and jobs are a key pillar of that. And that includes large-scale partnerships with industry, trying to help equip the workforce for the skills they need for the future. And this sort of involves large companies, small and medium companies, manufacturers, skills providers. And between them, this sort of partnership has pledged to upskill and reskill about 6 million people across the EU. We're also seeing in Spain, for example, released a just transition strategy last year, which sort of is targeted at existing workers, because obviously there's a huge overlap between fossil fuel workers and what's needed for the transition. So this includes kind of early retirement options, so taking people out of the workforce, but also prioritizing people leaving the workforce where possible in other projects, and mainstreaming this into overall employment policies, school curriculums, and across the board. I think there's also links to be made there between Europe and Africa and other regions. So the just energy transition partnerships that we see, for example, between South Africa and donors that was made at COP26 in Glasgow. And also very recently, the EU and the African Union at their summit proposing to have a just energy transition partnership there. So trying to exchange what's been learned in the EU and that ongoing process, but also increasing funding and the right kinds of funding to make sure that the reskilling is possible.
Yeah, great. We sort of obviously hear a lot about just transition in the European context of fossil industries. Is there a possibility of sort of swapping of knowledge between the North in Europe and South Africa and Africa in general in terms of even workforce? One of the things I think which GWO is really keen to highlight at this point is the fact that transboundary training is a real possibility. Do you think there's a policy demand for training either in Europe or in South Africa for each other's workforce, or is that something you think is too far? Andrea maybe wants to chip in and Anke on this.
Well, if I may start, I would say that there are countries that are essentially exporting workforce. If we look at the Baltics, we have a lot of people that come from Baltic countries where there is no significant wind development, but nevertheless they contribute with workforce to the development going on in Western Europe, especially in offshore wind markets. After all, those countries in the Baltics, but I can also mention Croatia or Poland, are home to naval institutes that produce a lot of brains that are then used in the workforce for offshore wind in Northern and Western Europe. So we see that the workforce is not necessarily coming from the countries where the workforce is needed the most. Nevertheless, those countries contribute a lot with training, and training centers are established there.
And also something that we discussed is from an opportunities point of view is the high level of unemployment in Africa. And that if you look at like the highest level of unemployment in the world, top 10 countries, 9 of them are in Africa. And we only have 7 or 8 training centers located in Africa, with 5 of them being in South Africa. And if we look at that as being an attractive point to look at from those who are wanting to become an entry-level worker in the wind workforce, that is a great opportunity for us. But then also the challenge for us is then getting the training to them. Not all of these guys are based in the countries that we want them to work in, and we need to either get them to our training centers or we need to get to them to do the training where they are. So yeah, that were both basically the 2 things that was stood out for me, and the 2 things that we discussed.
Absolutely. GWO are very supportive of growth across borders. You, Anke and Glen, do you want to chip in here then, please?
Yeah, just to build on what Anke was saying there, I mean, we're not just talking here about jobs, but it's also about decent jobs. And as Anke said, there's a much higher informal sort of employment in South Africa and some of these other countries than perhaps in Europe. And so I think this is where some of those learnings can come as well. It's not just advocating for jobs, but it's decent jobs that include good wages and benefits, long-term employment, adequate occupational health and safety, all of these, different things. And in some places, the kind of extent of unionization and labor rights as well, so that workers are able to advocate for this. So that obviously tends to be more limited in economies that have a higher degree of informality. So, certainly as us as an advocacy organization, we're trying to promote the side benefits effectively, or the kind of benefits that these jobs can bring outside of just pure employment, but bringing up the level of which these jobs are at.
I also think that, not just about, you just spoke about not just jobs, but quality jobs. With GWO training, you've got immediate, an immediate skills set in a very short amount of time. So you can do the training and you can go out there and try to get a job in a very short amount of time. And something that's also very attractive for South Africans specifically is also the opportunity to travel specifically because of our weak currency that we have here. So I think that is also some of the things that are that people ask us about, participants, about the opportunity of working abroad. Yeah.
And do you think you might get trainees from Europe looking to take advantage of the currency differential with South Africa, perhaps?
If possible, yes. Definitely, we do get people from all over who comes in. Obviously, the biggest group of guys that comes in do their training with us is from South Africa, but we also have people coming from abroad. So that is also very good for us. There's always a plus point, obviously, with that.
And a lot of Kenyans as well.
Yes, yes. We do get Kenyans. That's not obviously the biggest part of who we train, but yes, we have had Kenyans. Like I said, one of the guys that were in class with me, and that always also add to the learning experience to the other participants in the class, to hear their perspective of where they come from the areas that they are working in and the challenges that they face. So in a class environment, to have participants from all over the world is always a great plus point, to learn from each other's experiences.
Cool. One of the things which I was interested to hear about was actually we've analysed the amount of missing workforce or the gap in workforce over the next 5 years. What might be the effect of an aging population in certain parts of the world, possibly not in Africa, but I have read recently even that some African countries are beginning to age in their population structures. Andrea?
Well, I would say that one of the key challenges is that it becomes more difficult to recruit entry-level technicians. Yeah. So that's also where the import of brains from third countries becomes a value. I wanted to take back what Anjali was saying earlier about Kenya. We pointed out that there are a lot of policy efforts that countries can make, and they can do so much better in terms of designing frameworks for the development of wind power that last in time. And it's not the case for all countries, especially in Africa and Middle Eastern Africa. When I used to work as a wind analyst, wind market analyst back in the days, there were a lot of hopes that were put in Middle Eastern Africa. They haven't necessarily being satisfied in terms of capacity building and in terms of wind power development. It seems like, for example, in Kenya, there is a point where there is a need for workforce, but there is no enough incentive in terms of capacity and wind power growth to have a local workforce skilled. And in that case, they need to travel and go to South Africa, with the result that the second biggest nationality for people trained in GWO in South Africa is from Kenya.
Perhaps a question. Yeah, Anjali.
I just wanted to answer and follow up what Andrea said on Kenya. I think one of the issues in Kenya is also the social awareness and social acceptance for installation of the wind turbines, and also acquiring the land. And perhaps these both are one of the reasons, even though they have a good potential and policy developments in place, the market growth is lower than what is expected. And of course, it leads to the lower training needs and people traveling from Kenya to other region. Yeah, back to you, Ayan.
Yeah, sorry, just picking up some questions before. Andrea, you you didn't take to my question up about the attrition question. So I'm going to push that back to you. How do we find the missing people? And how do we start working out where these extra people are going to be found?
So on a global level, we have a increase in the workforce needed that is driven by the increase in wind power and demand for wind power. And on the other hand, we have attrition, meaning that people leave the industry, and they leave the industry for different industries. And in that case, the attrition is more or less 5 or 6%. So that means that over a period of 5 years, almost half of the people that will be needed in wind power as technicians or other types of workers will need to be entry level, and therefore there will need to be programs within companies, but also within countries and ministries that take that into account and allocate funding for the training of these workers and assign some funds for the development of skills within the wind sector. OEMs already have a lot of problems in sourcing entry-level technicians, and in order to duplicate training, they also need to have a stable approach, and stable and streamlined, a unified approach for the training of entry-level people.
We've had a question coming in from somebody who I'd like to put to the panel, and it's a little interesting way of looking at things. We talk about sort of a European perspective and as an African perspective, but of course in a global world, investors come from all parts of that world, and it's certainly noticeable how Chinese investors have been pursuing their objectives within sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Is that something which anybody has an opinion on, or will it be shaking up views on how training may be developed and how packages of investment might alter the workforce from particularly Chinese investors and players? Anke, are you noticing any Chinese investment in the African wind market making any waves?
I'm not too sure about that question.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Anjali, any thoughts about how the investment of Asians and particularly the Chinese into the EMEA region might be changing the way that the market and workforce is reacting?
I would what one thing is coming into my mind is example of Egypt and what it announced during COP26, and multiple business leaders went on and signed MOUs. These were from not only from Chinese but also from India as well. So it kind of, I think, depends upon government's will to accept and welcome those. And in terms of the local jobs in this region, as in when there is a plan to install something and it is going to be as per the timeline, I think there will be jobs established. I'm not really sure if I can comment on the cost of the local jobs, as I see in the question in the chat, Q&A box.
Okay. Glen, are you noticing any interesting trends coming from Asian investors into the EMEA region? The solar PV market, of course, was shaken up by, through Chinese investment into that area. Anything similar likely to come through for the wind, as far as you can see?
It's a good question, and I mean, I know less about the kind of private finance aspect of China's sort of ambitions, but I mean, from a kind of development finance perspective, I mean, China has, I think, changing. I mean, it's currently changing the way it looks at things like foreign aid. Obviously, in the past, it's kind of been more tailored towards Chinese objectives. And so with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, perhaps a slightly different approach to what Europe necessarily would aspire to. So more driven by national objectives than perhaps collaboration. And I think that is changing. So, I mean, that's more the development aid sort of perspective. From the private perspective, yeah, I have to say I'm no expert on the specifics of the international investment in that regard.
Okay, and Anke, you raised your hand again.
Yes, actually, Paolo, the owner and operations managers just walked in a while ago. So he said that he could give some input on the question just asked. I don't know. I see he isn't online. If you can give him access to participate, or
I'm
else
not
I can
sure we
ask him to come
can.
sit with me.
I'm not sure we
Okay.
can at this point. Is he with you? I mean, we don't actually have a lot of time left in the call, so maybe we can come back. You'll need to use your headphones. And you're not mic'd, I'm afraid, so perhaps we should move on.
There we go.
You're not mic'd. No. Sorry, nothing's coming through for whatever reason.
But let's say when it comes to foreign investment, especially from China and Europe, Africa is a mixed bag. We have large utilities like Anjali and NL with an EDF with a big foothold in the market. And then from a Chinese perspective, the most notable example is China Three Gorges being already an investor in the continent.
Yeah. Do we still have Anke with us, or is... Anke, can you say something? I don't know why we didn't have you before, but
Yes, I don't know. My mic is not working.
no, it is
just
now.
bombed
We
out.
can hear you
Is it
for
working?
sure.
Okay.
We can hear you. But perhaps
Yes.
we're running up to near the end anyway, but there's some more time for some more questions. What about the possible bottlenecks to the industry and its recruitment of an active workforce over the next 5 years time up to 2027? Bottlenecks that people recognize that there may be policy solutions in place, or Anjali, are you aware of any sort of further movements in terms of international cooperation to achieve a smoother workforce transition, or for people to enter through direct funding of training? Is that something which is being discussed at all, do you think? Because although there's investments, it's a trickle-down effect as far as I've seen in terms of training. Anything active in that area?
Well, I don't think so. Any such agreement or discussion is happening in terms of training needs. But I would say certainly there is a gap in terms of policy making where we don't see such plans for establishing the workforce needs. We focused on the top 10 countries in our report, and we see mostly in few of the countries where there is something happening from the government side as a policy step or as a program level to train the people and make them enter into the wind sector. So yeah.
Glenn, anything in terms of educational incentives to encourage training within this area, or just education within careers around renewables specifically?
Yeah, I mean, in most of the plans that we've seen in Europe and other places as well, Morocco has an energy efficiency strategy that includes, funding for some of these things. And obviously skills are just key. So in Europe, I mean, it's recognized that while there's a large overlap between skills existing in the workforce for fossil fuels and other industries, there's still a significant gap. And so there are a lot of parts, like I said, the Green Deal industrial plan, where they're trying to target partnerships to get a range of actors on board to figure out where those gaps actually are, and then get them to pledge to kind of upskill. And funding is just key. So to come back again to the just energy transition partnerships that the EU is trying to mobilize, I mean, with South Africa, France, Germany, and the UK, as well as the US and the EU, I mean, they're looking to commit something in the region of 10 billion for just financing through a first phase. So this is grants, concessional loans, investments, and this does include efforts to exchange on skills, to have specific programs for young people, but also for marginalized communities. So again, trying to come back to this more just aspect of the just transition, and to build that up. But I think, as was mentioned, it can be a slow process because, of course, it takes a while. The jobs, especially from the EU policy side, I mean, the jobs that will be required for the transition tend to require a higher level of skills. So that's not just in wind and solar, but in other aspects as well, batteries, manufacturing. And so this does require specific and targeted programs to reskill and to upskill. And again, targeting youth, women as well. A number of programs are kind of trying to bring these other benefits in. So just to say, in the EU, for example, this Green Industrial Plan, and they're aiming for 6 million people to be trained within this program, and this is through a mix of these public-private partnerships. And I think it's a bit of a buzzword to say partnerships, but I mean, this really is key. The government leveraging its money and experience to get the industry the jobs it needs.
Do you think there's a reticence for government and public fundings to be used to train a private workforce? Eventually, the wind industry is generally owned by the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think for governments, the priority is getting people employed. And so in the EU, I mean, it's seen, especially in the kind of post-COVID era, it's seen as a key part of the recovery is to increase the skills so that these private companies can produce more. I think, again, I'm speaking more of the EU because this is where I know best, but it's known that the jobs in renewable energy tend to be more productive as well. So over time, productive in terms of output per worker. And so, of course, from the main statistics, GDP, unemployment, industrial efficiency, these are all quite good benchmarks for governments to be advancing on. So, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily contradictory. And I think especially we're not in the early stage of development, but in the early stages of recovery. And as we increase the renewables very rapidly, those gaps are only going to get bigger unless governments are investing. So I think this is why we see every year more countries having these broader industrial policies that try and integrate this question everywhere, not just in renewables, but also in the education systems, in the way governments do tenders and invest. It's really across the whole board. So I would hope there's no tension there, and that it's more a case of partnering to fill the gaps.
Anjali.
I want to focus more in terms of manufacturing jobs. Of course, there is not in the scope of this report as we focus on construction and installation and O&M, but there are several fundings available through which say for example, IRA, Industrial Reduction Act in USA, and in India, for example, there is a production linked incentives which motivates production bases in India, make in India, for solar and batteries. So this way, this is also helping in creating manufacturing level jobs.
And just to build on that, to say that, I mean, we saw, especially in the like the IRA, the post-COVID recovery, because wind particularly had been affected by these supply chain issues that particularly in Europe and the US, I mean, there's a specific goal to increase manufacturing skills and jobs and local content to create jobs at a more local level. So, I mean, obviously you need that in addition to this kind of transboundary training and jobs. But yeah, I mean, I think governments in certain regions are very interested in trying to bring some of these things closer to home.
Absolutely. Anke, are you with us again? Then is there a sort of South African perspective on how the South African government is supporting training on the ground as such, whether or through educational establishments?
So every wind farm has economic development commitments that they need to allocate a certain amount of funds per year to skills development of not only local community but within South Africa. So it's kind of implicit to get the project signed. So to get a valid PPA, you need to have a commitment of a certain amount of money for skills. So it's an ongoing, so the current projects will feed on for the new projects. And as they come along, there's going to be more projects to feed on the skills.
So it's part of the licensing process.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And of course, that would be a very effective way of getting people local to an implementation project. Right. We're coming up to 5 minutes to the sort of final time we allotted for this call. Any last comments from around the table at the panel? Things that you've learnt either from today or from a point of view that's not come across that you wanted to make about skills and workforce development in the wind sector? Andrea, perhaps you can start off.
Well, from my perspective, it's more about recommendations on how to accelerate development for our stakeholders. Essentially two. One is for policymakers. If you are planning regulatory frameworks, for example, on local content, plan in a way that it allows enough people to work safely and develop the right skills locally. And then for training providers and educators, build capacity so that the best safety and technical competencies can be developed, especially for entry-level people.
Great. Glen, how about top tips for how we can sort of get more people into renewables and wind?
Don't think I have much to add to Andrea. I mean, I think at the highest level, we need to keep pushing for the clear market signals. I mean, that's what drives growth and drives jobs. You know, putting in the public money to make good on those promises through things like the US Inflation Reduction Act, these style of policies. So really trying to change the mindset when it comes to you know, industrial plans. And I would just come back to the advocacy aspect as well, sort of promoting the idea that these jobs can reskill people that would otherwise be losing jobs, which helps with the acceptability issue, you know, and to advocate for these jobs to be good jobs, you know, with the right sort of training in place. And I think as Europe and other places, you know, in the wealthy countries develop these programs, hopefully through these partnerships, we see a transfer of that knowledge and skills in terms of training towards, you know, the African region as well.
Great. Anjali, what's your take on this? You get your fingers and involved in lots of different countries. What's the one thing that you see as a common thread that can be improved to deliver on this forecast?
I think I would like to build upon what Andrea and Glen said and highlight one gap that we also spoke earlier during this webinar, is that we are lacking the involvement of making skilling as a part of the policy planning. And if we do a good efforts on advocacy, this will really help in ensuring the 360-degree completion of what we forecast and much more. So yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give the final word to Anke. You've got your feet on the ground here. What would be the one thing that would allow you to do more training, do you think? Or answer any other question which you want to, of course, make.
No. I think the one thing that we also discussed was that I briefly mentioned earlier was the challenge of getting instructors. And I mean, we need instructors to instruct, we need instructors to train the skills. And as it's fairly a very short-staffed group of people, we also need to train the people who come in here who wants to become an instructor. It's not something that is very much out there. So with the opportunity of IQT that has recently launched, we can now start upskilling people who are wanting to have a different challenge in the wind industry, seeking a different opportunity to do something else, a career change, or if someone wants to come in and work in a facility and want to instruct because they want something a little bit more grounded, don't want to travel as much anymore, or want something a little bit less physically. There are other opportunities in the wind industry for people who has been technicians, because what not better than a technician who instructs? And that is what we also believe in at SP Wind, is that is the best teacher, the teacher who has worked in the field. So I think that is also a very big challenge going ahead of how we're going to attract people to come and instruct for us. The people that are really going to be passionate about taking across these skills to create and help build the workforce.
Wow, I think that's a very important point. One close to GWO's heart, and Anke mentioned IQT, which is a GWO program which is not quite launched yet, but will be shortly.
Yes.
To tackle bottlenecks in terms of instructor development. Yeah, if we don't have the people to teach the people, then we don't get the people. That's coming up to, we've now actually just touched 3 o'clock here in Copenhagen, and that was our allotted hour. So I'd like to thank our panelists for today. Andrea Scassola, who's from GWO, Anjali Lathigara from GWEC, Glen Wright from REN 21, and not least Anke Jordaan from SP Wind. We will be putting up the transcript or the recording of the webinar onto the GWO YouTube channel, and we'll also be sharing that with GWEC, who will be doing the same. That normally takes a couple of days, I have to say, and we will also be sending through the presentation to those people that attended the seminar within the next few days. And that's all from me in Buckland from GWWO in Copenhagen, and thank you for your time this afternoon, and for the rest of the team. Bye-bye.